Well, thank you very much to everyone for coming. I'm going to save myself the relation of titles of the present. There are many very important people. Obviously, the President of the Argentine Republic stands out above all the others. But given all by greeting, this is an act in which we come to listen to Argentina, to me, and I am not going to waste time in presenting. So thank you very much to all present. I see among all the present many faces, many compatriots in struggle, people who have fought with us against socialism, against anti-Semitism, against interventionism, against the linguistic imposition in Spain, and in other ways here have fought against the enemies of freedom. And here we are. I consider all of you compatriots in struggle, each one with what he supports, each one in what he can, but the Club de los Viernes is a club that was born, precisely, to give an umbrella or blanket to all those liberals who in Spain felt lonely, they felt isolated. And were not able to find an area in which to express their ideas. They did not know how to handle themselves, where to publish an article, how to get relevance. With him to contact to set up a demonstration in favor of a just cause, etc., etc. There was an atomization, as happens a lot in society, in which people heap problems. And we, a group of people originally born in Asturias, in a small province in northern Spain, decided to dedicate our time, our effort, and part of our money to cover that need. The Club de los Viernes was born as a public service to the defenders of freedom. That is the Club de los Viernes. When the Club de los Viernes discuss what strategy should we follow, the Club de los Viernes does not follow any strategy. The Club de los Viernes supports individual or collective initiatives in favor of freedom, always. Whoever wants to work the most, in one sense, the Club de los Viernes will support that the most. We are able to support any area that includes individual freedom of state power. For us it is that basic. We are not going to guide it in one sense or another. The people themselves will have to ask us, and we only do it as a cover. We set up social networks. We set up Twitter. We get followers to put them at the service of whoever needs them. Because this is a struggle that although we are liberals and therefore we can have some individualist temptation, it is true that liberalism in the background is a great movement in favor of freedom. It is a great movement in favor of individual freedom. And since I do not want to take any more time, I'm not the one who has to say here. For those who do not know the Club de los Viernes, I'm going to give 2 minutes to explain how we are born. In December 2014, among 4 people, we set up an account on Twitter. That is the beginning. Period. We called the Club de los Viernes. We put a photo of the founding fathers of the United States. And there we started. According to the Constitution of the United States, individual freedom, etc. 2 months later, we are 12 and we are in a restaurant in Oviedo, where we decided precisely that between the 12 of us we are going to give this umbrella. 3 months later, we organized an event in Oviedo where we invited Daniel Lecay, who was here from Poland. And suddenly, we, who are nobody, managed to break the gap. And we said, well, we have to turn this into something more serious. We made an association. 2 months later, we were 200 founding fathers. And from there, we began to expand all over the world, etc. To grow, I'm not going to tell you, which is a very long story. A lot of work and many hours spent. Until in the end, we came to what we are. And finally, the only thing about these awards. This is the 5th edition. The previous awards winners are almost all here. It is Professor Huerta de Soto, Federico Jimenez de los Santos, who was sitting there, Professor Carlos Rodriguez Bran, Isabel Diaz Ayuso, and the 5th award in the 5th edition, which is where we are today, awards, School of Salamanca, Club de los Viernes. It is for those who ask for great sport, the excellent Mr. Javier Milei. Thank you very much. Very well. Next, it is an honor for me to introduce our next speaker, for which I will say, without preceding the words of our great friend, Karl Marx. For a long time, theorists have been dedicated to interpreting the world. It is time to transform it. Well, Mr. Jesús Huerta de Soto is not only the greatest exporter in, as we all know, in knowledge, erudition and intellectual creativity in Austrian school thinking. It is also, without a doubt, one of the greatest proponents and catalysts of the practice of ideas of freedom. I would like it to be our applause, the sample of the deserved respect and admiration that we have from Mr. Jesús. Mr. Jesús.
Thank you all. I hope you can hear me even in the most remote corners of these impressive facilities. Today we grant the Salamanca School Award to the President of the Argentine nation, but it has been awarded to 4 predecessors, among whom I am humbly 78, 06, 21,500, 06, 26,500, but without a doubt, the person who deserves this award the most. The Salamanca School is President Javier Milei, and my talk will be aimed at demonstrating it. Because President Milei is not a professional politician. President Milei is a professor of economics, and is also a professor of economics who has dominated absolutely his subject. But at a certain point he came into contact with the Austrian School of Economics. He has explained it many times, and that made a radical turn in his academic life. And he came and thanks. He has also explained it in an article that he devoured, in a state of febrile excitement written by Rothbard, explaining the Austrian theory of the market of monopoly and competition. In the year 1974, the Nobel Prize in Economics was granted to Hague, and that brought a tremendous resurgence of the Austrian school. And the historic conference was organized in South Royalton in the United States, one of the most important academies in the world of the Austrian school. And among them was Murray Rothbard. And Murray Rothbard presented a paper. The article presented by Murray Rothbard is entitled New Light on the Prehistory of the Austrian School. That is, New Light on the Prehistory of the Austrian School. And what is the thesis of this article? Well, the thesis of this article is very simple. Rothbard shows that the origin of the Austrian School of Economics is found in those great thinkers of the Spanish Golden Century, clustered around the University of Salamanca, that is, in the School of Salamanca. Rothbard started from a previous tradition. We have the work of Majory, Grace Hutchinson on monetary theory, and its origin in the scholastics of our Golden Century. And a few years later we organized in Madrid the first meeting of the Montpellier Society, of which I became vice president, and that in its statutes established the demand that there be a democratic environment. We had to wait for Franco to die to organize it. Well, in that process of organization, a letter was written here, which works in my power, where it says that it is pristinely demonstrated that the origin of the idea of the free market and liberalism is not in Anglo-Saxon Scotland, but is a Catholic, continental European origin, and that the thought of freedom is basically a thought that has its origin in the School of Salamanca, elaborated by Jesuits and Spanish Dominicans. And it also says that from his knowledge of the bibliography, he quotes Rothbard, he also quotes the works of Robertson, etc. He has no doubt that this is the right conclusion to which we must reach. President Milei writes an article entitled The Neoclassical Trap, and with it I have the honor to participate and contribute. That was elaborated and edited by my right-hand student and full minister in the academic field, Professor Philip Beckers. Well, the very brief thesis of this article by President Milei, The Neoclassical Trap, is that in the world of the neoclassical mainstream, there is a seductive intellectual trap in which many fall, because they elaborate a phantasmagorical model of equilibrium They even call it in a resounding way, dynamic stochastic general equilibrium models. They are models that are populated by robots. They are not human beings. They are robotized penguins that react to the stimuli of the outside world. And then these colleagues of mine, who are majority members in the academy, develop these phantasmagorical models. They compare it with reality, and when they do not coincide, they conclude that it is reality that is wrong. And in this case, first and foremost, what we have to do is resort to the Pope to force and manipulate reality and take it to those hypothetical models that only exist in their stubborn mathematical minds. And this is a very clear, very convincing, very accurate idea, but one that has its origin in our scholastic of the Spanish Golden Age. In 1943, the Spanish Jesuit Cardinal, Juan de Lugo, asks himself, can we get near the price of equilibrium? And he comes to the conclusion that it depends on such a large amount of circumstances, time and place, that only God could get to know it. Literally, because he wrote in Latin, he said, they called it the just mathematical price of things, the price of equilibrium. This was in the year 1643. But a few years earlier, another cardinal, Spanish Jesuit Juan de Sales, still deepened more and said, it is possible that the rulers, the academics, anyone can get to do a specific information that the economic agents manage in the market. And he comes to the following conclusion. He says that it is impossible because it is not possible for anyone to understand and ponder. That is, only God and not men can understand and ponder the information and the knowledge that a free market has with all its particular circumstances and place. How many thousands of hours lost by my colleagues, the academics of equilibrium, if they had studied our scholars in time. That day we also indirectly pay tribute to the prize that takes its name, to the president of the Argentine nation. But secondly, we are going to see 10 direct connections between what this man is doing and our scholars of the Spanish Golden Age. And this is that my law, I just mentioned it, came into contact with the Austrian school, taking into account the inanity, that is, the intellectual and academic void, of the neoclassical concept of competition. According to my colleagues, they are monopolies, and they believe to observe that there is a single offer that has been chosen by the market, and competition if they believe to observe that there are many competing, but also, and for greater mockery, because it is really a mockery, they add the qualification of perfect, and they talk about that there is perfect competition, if that multiplicity of offerings is characterized, because everyone does the same, they sell exactly the same product. It is qualified as perfect competition. It is something that should be qualified as something that is a most opposite of the concept of competition that can be imagined, and this was already seen by scholars of the Golden Age. We have the case of Luis de Molina, here in 1597 said that competition is a dynamic process of rivalry, obviously. In Latin, they use the term concurrentium, concurrentia, that is competition. And we have the case perfectly described of Jerónimo Castillo de Bobadilla. Jerónimo Castillo de Bobadilla, great a manual entitled Politics for Correctors. The correctors were the local authorities in the 16th century. Jerónimo Castillo de Bobadilla describes the essential economic law of this dynamic process of rivalry, which is the correct concept of competition, developed by the scholars of the Golden Age, and he was the one who drinks and who constitutes all the theory of competition and monopoly of the Austrian school. Jerónimo Castillo de Providencia says that the prices of the products would drop because of competition and competition of sellers. Obviously, dynamic process of rivalry. Also, the scholars of the Golden Age make an essential contribution because all our economy, all our science, enters a dead end because of those wrong thinkers who have their origin in Adam Smith, and he then developed the classical school of economy. And I say that they are wrong and that they have done not only our discipline, but humanity, for having reintroduced the objective theory of value, when our scholars of the Golden Age have made it perfectly clear that value is something subjective. I would like, because I am giving a class on economy, and I am giving also in honor of President Milei, to make a reference to what perhaps exposes for the first time in a clear way the subjective theory of value, which is the great Bishop of Segovia, Diego de Covarrubias and Leiva, who already in the year 1555 wrote the following. He says the value of a thing does not depend on its objective nature, but on the subjective estimation of men. They call it common estimatio in Latin. Even if such estimation is allocated, in Latin it is written in sona estimatio, in sona allocated, adding to illustrate his thesis, that in the Indies were America then. They had not yet called it America. The weight is valued more than in Spain, because they men estimate it more subjectively, and despite the fact that the nature of wheat is exactly the same, the objective nature of wheat is exactly the same in both places. And there's another scholastic, Luis Arabi de la Calle, who also has the merit of writing not in Latin but in Spanish. His book is entitled Instruction of Merchants. Today I would say instruction for entrepreneurs. They are the instructions of what entrepreneurs had to do, not to commit mortal sin and hell. But they became these theologians. And following this tradition, he is the first to discover that it is not the costs that determine the prices. A very serious error of the neoclassical economists, who have the origin of Adam Smith, who only looked at a hypothetical natural price of balance in the long term with perfect adjustment. Of course, by definition, prices and costs coincide, and come to the conclusion that, therefore, it is a very serious error, but it is supposed to cross an abyss, which is a very serious error from a scientific point of view, because already Luis Arabi de la Calle said very clearly, this he measured the fair price of things, according to the work, costs and dangers, of which he treats or makes a merchandise. They fight a lot because the fair price comes from the abundance or lack of merchandise, of merchants and money, and not from the costs, but from the work and dangers. Then the lay, by the subject of his theorists of the Salamanca School, who are building the foundations of the Austrian School of Economics. But let's go to another connection, and this is important, because President Milei, the Argentines, all those of us who follow him in the world, and his contribution to the cultural battle, but we are not aware that the background, what is behind it, is the thought of the Salamanca School with the Spanish century, and that is why it has to be well established and clear today. President Milei repeats over and over again that inflation is always and everywhere a monetary phenomenon, or is not it? One another to the kiss allows on duty to everyone. Well, this is also a clearly scholastic idea, because these great thinkers of the Spanish Golden Century or witnesses of the phenomenon that was the massive arrival of precious metals to Spain as a consequence of the discovery of America, the massive arrival of precious metals. Monetary growth is a poison gift. It was the main reason why Spain was turned into an aerial. What happened? The massive arrival of money made the price of the money drop, its purchasing power. That is to say that the prices of goods and services were multiplied, and therefore all Spanish products stopped being competitive. What was interested was to buy them outside of Spain, With the same speed that gold arrived, it went out to buy goods and services of all kinds in Italy, France, Germany, etc. But Spain stopped being competitive. As a consequence of the monetary injection, there was no exciting professional career for the young Spaniards except for three: church, sea or royal highs. That is to get ecclesiastical benefit and life off the church's income. C. Crossing the ocean to privilege. In the recent discovery of America or Royal House, of course, is first-hand witnesses at this inflationary phenomenon, very similar to what we have experienced later in the rest of the world, and specifically in Argentina. We have the great Dr. Navarro, who is called Martin das Procurata. He, by the way, was the cousin of San Francisco Javier. Explains the phenomenon very clearly. By the way, he was not the first from the intellectual point of view, but he articulates it. Because there are both presidents in Nicholas Osmi, in Baden or above all in Copernicus, and his work Moneticulum Diris here. But notice how he writes what he says in his resolution of changes. Dr. Navarro Martin des Procurata in 1556. He says in France, where there is less money than in Spain, the bread, wine, cloth, hands and work. And even in Spain, in the time when there was less money, much less were the things sold, the hands and work of men, that after the Indies, recently discovered, covered it with gold and silver, the cause of which is that the money is worth more, where and when there is lack of it, and where and when there is abundance. This explains the quantitative theory of value, but they would have made a serious mistake, the same as the monetarists, if they had stayed in the quantitative theory of money. Yes, it has a real fun, and it is important that people do not forget it, but it is not the most important thing at the damage that inflation does, because more than generating an increase of variation in inflation is a revolution in prices that completely distorts the allocation of resources and generates speculative bubbles that sooner or later reverse in the form of deep crises, and that is something that the neoclassical theorists, quantitative theorists cannot understand. Coming to Chicago because they lack the knowledge at the theory of capital developed by the Austrian school, and which supposes that bridge for understanding is the monetary side and the real side of the economy, and they develop a whole bank theory, which I have had the honor of developing in my work Money, Credit and Economic Cycles, which is also enormously relevant for President Milei and for what he promised in his campaign and has on his roadmap. Basically, dollar and eliminate the central bank, because our theorists from the School of Salamanca, starting with Martin das Procurata, Les Cerebi de las Tal, etc., make it very clear that one thing is to lend, and another completely different thing is to deposit, and that the bankers, when they appropriate the money that has been deposited inside, commit a grave mortal sin and go to hell. But not only do the bankers go to hell when they appropriate the deposits inside, but also when they commit a sin. At least they came. The depositors themselves, when they make a deposit and look to the other side, and even instead of paying, because the depositor would have to pay the banker, he demands that the banker give him some interest. Here it is very funny, the Usury Vita Lacau says, these depositors who look to the other side gave this daughter to the luxurious to take care of her, and instead of paying the caretaker they demand the luxurious. Hey, give me some money, says Luis Olivia de la Cal. What do you think you do the luxurious with the daughter? Well, that's exactly what the bankers do. Well, also not to help, but at least a few years in purgatory the depositors would have to go, because then those depositors, they would cry and rob the stores. But they were very happy when they were donating an interest in deposits in dollars, to which they had no right from the point of view at the rate of ownership. And it is also that our scholastics discover that when the bank acts legitimately with a coefficient a fractional reserve. They generate a system deeply unstable in the form of trusted means. I deposit, the bank appropriates. Pay with that those who received the loan. Return to depository and so on. It is the main mechanism of monetary creation that exists today, the illegitimate exercise, as our scholastics demonstrate, of the cow with fractional reserve. And in the end it turns out that only a small fraction of the European currency in euros, or in dollars, or in pesos, or in whatever. I say it here because I was going to bring it for illustration in this crap. The 9/10 of the money used by human beings are not but accountable notes of the banks that are the result of that process of generation of trusted means. Luis de Molina called a chirograph pecuniarum through this process of indebted appropriation of the deposits of its clients. And Luis Arabi de la Calle also has a proto-Austrian theory of the economic cycle, because it explains that this phenomenon, our appropriation of deposits, initially generates a bubble of artificial prosperity, but that sooner or later everything goes to waste, as Thomas de Mercader says. Simply to comply with the principles that the moral and the law of rem and law demand in relation to the deposit aside. That is, that the depositor, the banker who receives the money, has to maintain at all times the integrity of the tantum, in Roman law, the equivalent in quantity and quality, to what is deposited at all times, which in terms of economic theory is called a fit, or coefficient of 100% fit, but especially in Argentina. Because if this was done, first we would end up with a financial system that is incredible, that is still in force in the 21st century, which is a continuous source of financial instability, and of banks that develop and gigantic banks that then disappear one day, and so on. We would end up with that continuous instability. Secondly, it would allow us to dollarize 100%, and there would be no possibility of running out of money the next day. Everyone would have their money available at the time it was needed. And if it turns out that, as I understand, as the president himself explained not long ago, a few weeks ago, in the residence of the Oliveres, as a result of their successful policy, for the Argentine people to know and be clear that they will never suffer again. In addition to stabilizing the system of successive bubbles and recurrent crises, and then, if the system is stabilized, it is no longer necessary for a lustage loanee to be there to save the banks from their worries that are regularly known to come again and again, without any problem. This is the agenda of President Milei, eliminating the central bank. This is another direct connection between President Milei and the scholars of our golden century. Either way, it would get the president that many bankers and clients would not go to hell. This is also very important. But there is another connection, and it is that President Milei has made a historic proposal that consists in declaring an impregnable crime, and therefore to prosecute and punish all those who participate in the direct or indirect way in the inflationary process, either by monetization of public deficit or by credit expansion. Therefore, they would prosecute the presidents of central banks, advisors of central banks, Jerome Powell, Christine Lagarde, even my close friend, the vice president, the European Central Bank, Luis de Guindos. They would all have been prosecuted, and their season would pass as God commands in jail, for having been participants and protagonists of the inflationary process. And not only that, the one he does more harm to the poorest and most vulnerable classes. That is why they have to be prosecuted and put in jail. And this is a contribution of our scholars I am now going to make a mention of the great Father Juan de Mariana, born in Talavera de la Reina in 1536, and died in Toledo at the age of 88 in 1624. The great Father Juan de Mariana was the son of the great Father Felipe Roman III. This manual is published as Regis Institutions on the monarchy and the royal institution, and it is an interesting manual because it develops the theory of the tyrannicide. The theory of the tyrannicide means that Felipe Roman III, who was a very pacifist king, became a tyrant king. By the way, a theory of the tyrannicide has already been developed before Juan de Mariana, but he could not say who had developed it, because they had all been prosecuted and condemned. They were those heroes of freedom. He were the protagonists of the first libertarian revolution in the world, which was the revolution of the communists of Castile and Maldonado, but it is not mentioned to the fore. Who is the Bishop Aquino of Zamora, who carried his private army of Dominicans and Franciscans to fight against the tyrant King Carlos V, who eventually, as we all know, in the battle Filala of the communists. On April 23, the day I arrived in Buenos Aires, in 1521, but as they were prosecuted, Juan de Mariana reproduced it as if it were his idea. And what is the thesis of the tyrannicide? The thesis is that any individual citizen not only can but has the obligation to kill. With this that king he becomes a tyrant. And what is the tyrant? Describe what a tyrant is. He gives a series of descriptions and says that he is a tyrant. That one imposes taxes on citizens without their consent. 2, that unjustly expropriates their property. 3, that prevents a democratically elected parliament from meeting, with another series of characteristics. A tax without their consent. But in 1609, Juan de Mariana wrote another work called The Monarchy Mutation, translated into Spanish, a brief treatise on the Balan coin in Castilla and other disorders and abuses, where he denounces the policy of the king of Felipe Roman III, or rather of his Alido, the Duke of Lima, consisting of embezzling the currency, that is, extracting metal prices and multiplying the number of units. He does not have the term today we would call inflation, and he comes to the conclusion that neither more nor less. He has imposed a very harmful tax, especially on the poorest, and also a tax that has been established in a sinister way and without the consent of citizens. A tax, I read, that records those who have money before the prices go up, and therefore they are forced to buy the most expensive things. Then the syllogism is very clear. King Tyrant, the one to be killed. All those who participate directly or indirectly in this process must or can be murdered. As we see, the president is much more benign because he only intends to judge them and put them in jail for at least 20 or 30 years, taking into account the damage they do. But it is also, and for all those who listen to me, we are going to talk about the famous Motosera, especially because I have a beautiful photograph that I took with President Milei in the Pink House. And I remember that I had my face sunburned because I had been there in the sun at the funeral of poor Pope Francis. We take the photo with the famous chainsaw, which has already become legendary, and we are going to talk about it. But it turns out that the chainsaw is also of scholastic origin, as I am going to demonstrate now. The chainsaw is scholastic in 2 areas, in the regulatory area and in the area of public spending reduction. The regulatory area. In the year 2023, 1,350,000 regulations were published in Spain. Among all the official ballots of the state, autonomous communities and city councils, 47% of this 1,350,000 are official data from the AVC, which has a follow-up on this. 47% had its origin in Europe. And there is a kind of legislative infraction. That is what has made Europe stop being competitive. Even Mario Draghi himself has had to admit it. We cannot do anything or be competitive with this absurd regulation. And the President of the Commission, von der Leyen, says, "Yes, I have received the message. I have already ordered all my officials to be German. I apologize. In some cases, yes, in others, not. We would have to analyze it." But let's see what Father Juan de Mariana says. In a work, I have the first edition, posthumo, was published. In his treatise on the diseases of the company is the company of Jesus. Father Juan de Mariana says the following. He says that the government wants to guide the one he sees, and that the rulers do not know the people, or the facts at least, with all the circumstances they have, and of which this success depends. It is forced that many and serious iron falls, and that is why people dislike, and the government despises so blind. And he concludes that the power and command is crazy, and that when the laws are many in excess of 50,000 pages, and is not all can be saved, not even knowing all of them, respect is lost. And it is a great merit of President Milei to have created a Minister of Deregulation. A Minister of Deregulation, which is Dr. Sturzenegger, who, by the way, gave me a very big hug after my incendiary Anarcho-capitalist speech. There is a Minister of Deregulation that has an average of 40 regulations a day, and that has more than 1,000. It has become a worldwide model to follow by all. We have the case. We do not know how it will end. Elon Musk and even the President of the European Commission, instead of a Vice President like the one he has, a Vice President of Deregulation. Then we see how the SOMO, in the regulatory fields, is also scholastic origin. Then it has a lot of merit that 400, 500 years later, the President of the Argentine nation is taking it to practice, which is not only in the regulatory field. The chainsaw is also very important to carry out in the field of spending, because you have to put the chainsaw to the expense. This is obvious. And here, if there is someone who can present a model executive, and who has no precedence in history, is the President of my law. Because in a year and a half he has reduced public spending by 30%, because he has reduced, as there was no need to finance, monetizing the deficit, has reduced inflation from 25% that was in the month, has reduced poverty from 50 to 30 points. And last week we read that even that institution, that is the United Nations, was forced to recognize that more than 1,700,000 children have left poverty thanks to that reduction of public spending. And look at the number of children that are going to leave poverty if the chainsaw continues to get in all public spending institutions, etc. We owe it to the children of Argentina and to all children in the world. But I am going to finish my speech making a reference that perhaps few people know, because we have to be aware that the influence of the scholars of the Spanish century is the one that's behind all the revolutions in favor of freedom. In the contemporary history of the human gender, when the fathers of the United States, headed by Jefferson, were deciding whether to revolt or not. What does Jefferson do? He recommends to everyone, starting with James Madison, that they read the history of Father John de Mariana that had just been translated by Captain Stevens. And why does Jefferson recommend to the founding fathers? Because this is the history of Spain, written from the perspective of the fight generation after generation of the human being who wants to be free against the claws of the coactive state. And in that history they are presented as tyrants to which they have to kill. The great heroes of history, who are the ones who write the winners. The history of Father John de Mariana ends just before the revolution of the communists, so as not to get into dangerous lands. We, the Spaniards, have to be very proud that the great fathers, as a North American homeland, have lived from this Hispanic tradition, this tradition of a School of Salamanca is a great contribution of the Spanish culture in America. This was studied by an Argentinian teacher of the history of thought of Romanian origin or spot school. He studies the scholastics who drink from these fountains. They are students of whom I have just mentioned, and they occupy their classes. In Albornoz in 1573, Juan de Marcianso in 1580, and how this tradition ends up influencing, for example, the great process of Argentina in José de San Martin, when he rises against the tyrant king, or the case of Juan Bautista Alberti, the father of Argentinian liberal constitutionalism. But we do not stop here. For all those who listen to me, and those who continue to be inspired by the thought of our scholars of the golden century, today has its natural continuation in the anarcho-capitalist and libertarian revolution that is taking place all over the world, with the leadership of this man, President Javier Milei, and that therefore today is deserved by all of us. By the way, thank you very much, Don Jesús, because all the copies that we have at our disposal of the one that is already bestseller at its cost, so thank you very much, Don Jesús. And I would not like to continue without taking the opportunity to make an explicit recognition with all our feelings with this towards the fundamental pillar of this revolutionary administration that, as always, has several gears, and that fundamental pillar is the boss, Ms. Karina Milei. For him I ask for a strong applause. Well, we come to the culminating moment of this very special event, and for that I give the floor to the person who with so much passion has carried out the Herculean and Titanic task of raising this act. She is the president of the Club de las Fiends, Ana Gómez, for him I ask for applause.
Thank you very much. Ladies and gentlemen, excellent Mr. Javier Milei, in a world that kneels for mediocrity, He decided to stand up where others asked for permission to be free. He broke the chains with a rush of true ideas. He did not come to ask for forgiveness for being free, for defending freedom, property, reason of the individual. He came to say the indescribable, that the state is not the savior. The state is the devil. And he did not say it with fear. He said it with the clarity of the men who defend a conviction, who defend true ideas. You are a man who does not need to be proven, but understate. Like all of us who defend freedom. And it is so difficult to make ourselves understand with something so simple that it is a natural good. The Club de los Viernes gives you a prize today, a freedom, but not as a concession, but as a recognition. Because freedom is not beggared. It is not political. You are a free man. And that is the greatest title that a human being can take. It is for me a huge honor to be able to give the award of the freedom of the Club de los Viernes, School of Salamanca. Thank you. Good afternoon. Thank you very much for this recognition. Apart from now, I will take it to the Chief of Protocol. You cannot take it from me. It is a warning. It is also a huge pleasure to always have the opportunity to listen to this Colossus of freedom, which is Dr. Jesús Huerta de Soto. When we made the first attempt, Argentina is a country that has its complexities. I had been thinking of putting together a sort of talk with something like a construction of a geological tree of the School of Salamanca. And when they told me that Professor Huerta de Soto was going to be there, I had to say, Professor Huerta de Soto is going to say much more interesting things. I had thought of doing a review on the theory of value, a monetary theory on banking theory, on the labor market, and the whole discussion of the interest rate, a very complex discussion. In reality, I felt that what I could do the most, how are you? What I could do as a contribution to bring something different was to tell you my experience. That is to say, that basically is the way we are eradicating inflation. We came to power. Inflation was running more than 1% per day. That in annual terms is about 3,500% per year. In fact, if one takes the wholesale inflation, which is the one that usually leads, and it is the one on which I make continuous reference, it had been 54% per month. That has annualized, it is 17,000. That is to say, at that level of madness, inflation was traveling in Argentina. And basically, as Professor Huerta de Soto points out, I spent years repeating a phrase. I, Milton Friedman, but with some improvements that, for those who understand in theory of value, are substantial, and they know that only the beginning is by Milton Friedman, but the rest contains a lot of Austrian gold and its origin in the School of Salamanca. The postulate is simple. It is known. And in fact, yesterday on Twitter, after the monthly inflation of 1.5, that is to say, the consumer inflation, which at the time was 25.5%, which in terms of interannuals reached almost a peak of 300%. Today, basically, if one takes the interannual, it is at 43%. But if one takes the peak, it is already at 20%. And believe me, I am going to give now the reasons why it will continue to go down, and we are going to exterminate it. And it was fundamental to tackle the inflationary problem. But clearly, as our largest exporter says, the city of liberty in Argentina, Professor Alberto Venegas and Chichir, says there is nothing more useful than a good theory. And the postulate is, inflation is always and everywhere monetary phenomenon, until there comes the phrase of Friedman, and there we add, generated by an excess of money supply, either because the supply rises or because the demand falls, or both things at the same time, which leads to a loss of purchasing power of money. That is, or the prices expressed in monetary units rise, which is what we know as inflation. So from that diagnosis, what we decided is, okay, we have to cut the emission of money. And in that context, we find a fiscal deficit of 15 points at the GDP, 5 in the national treasury, 10 in the central bank. And the important thing is that, in addition, that debt that the central bank had, which in reality was neither more nor less, debt that had been generated because the state, the central bank finance, the national state with monetary emission, and then retrieve that money, sterilize it by paying interest rates, being condemned, the unpleasant monetary arithmetic, to say that the final result ended up being more inflationary because it ended up emitting more because the tax issue was never corrected. That was given in a situation where, in addition, within the central bank there were 4 monetary bases. And during the previous government, this passage came in an average period between 60 days and 90 days. And one of the things that the previous government did was to pass all those monetary pesos in one day. That is to say, we could find a situation that overnight the amount of money was doubled, with the disaster that could imply. Not only that, but also there were payments of debt in pesos for the equivalent of 90 billion American dollars. And given the relationship, given what was basically the amount of monetary bases in Argentina, there was at least between 8 and 9 monetary bases. More than F, obviously, you had to pay and didn't have the resources. he would have multiplied by 10 the amount of money. Notice that we had hidden about 50 monetary bases going around. In addition, in the market of intervened changes, and with a gap of 200%, that is the type of official exchange and the type of parallel exchange. Basically, there was a 3-to-1 relationship. Central bank had negative international reserves of $12 billion. We had debts with importers to the equivalent of $45 billion, and we were also in default with the agreement with the International Monetary Fund because we never met the fiscal goals. That is, we were literally naked, full of water, beat, sitting in the electric chair. And with many trying to plug it and make it work right. That's why many times I say that we have to know how to stand between libertarian liberals and liberal libertarians. In this group, I always include the idiot, handsome and how, and others from Argentina who say the same stupid things. The problem is that closing the central bank would not solve the problem. The problem was the remunerated passes and the monetary funder passer. And if he closed the central bank like this, because yes, the value of those instruments was made to zero. And the only way to make those instruments zero is by taking the price level to zero, would have resulted in tremendous hyperinflation. Poverty would have exploded, and it would have gone to 95%. We would have had an even worse situation than that of Venezuela. And when the holidays came, when Christmas and New Year arrived, all the Viernes thugs would have started looting and others. So this is not only about economic theory, it's about understanding sequentialities. It's about understanding how perverse it is. I must be melting. How perverse politics is. And above all things, you have to know what to do, how to do it. But above all things, you have to be brave. Therefore, in this context, the main thing we had to do was to end inflation. And with that, we had to end the monetary funds. That is, it was necessary to stop the machine that printed money. And that's the first thing we did. We cut with the tax deficit. Here it's very interesting. In a talk, Dr. Sturzenegger raises it in a great way. He says that many people call her, although in this part of the chainsaw, it's the chainsaw of Capito that made me very happy when they named him the best minister of economy in the world. He says that many people call her from his role as a professor at Harvard. Many people call him to tell him, well, I have to make the adjustment, and how do I do it? And so he says, well, how much do you have to adjust? Okay, and what are you going to do? Well, more or less, 1 point per year. And he says, and you? Well, what do you think if you adjust 5 in a month? He says, no, that's impossible. Well, what we did, we adjusted 5 in a month. In straight figure, I tell you that we adjusted 5, we adjusted 7, because in the mess we were, literally in the electric chair, and one began to cut. Then we overreacted the adjustment. We made an adjustment of 7 points. And then we started to recompose gains, specifically the public spending. We reduced it by 30%. In fact, a job that was done by the helpers, Dr. Schwarzenegger. He says, well, I'm going to check in time. From the year 40 onwards, he made such a reduction of public spending. And then he says that he found 14 cases, but all those cases had been given after a war. That is to say that there is no historical record of anyone who has reduced 30% public spending without being that war. That is with which we also made the biggest fiscal adjustment in history. But that's not all, because we also had 10 points from the GDP in the central bank. So our first task was to stop the first issue of the emission, which was to cut with the fiscal deficit. And we did that in the first month. We have 17 continuous months of financial surplus. That is, not only in the operative, but we also paid the interest. And in that context, the country's risk that was around the 3,000 basis points today is trying to break the 600 basis points. That is, there's a drastic drop in the interest rates as a consequence of the reduction of the country's risk. Therefore, the second phase of the program consisted now in ending the fiscal deficit. That basically what we did is that we rather assumed, because we did not have dollars to defend the type of exchange, we could not lift all restrictions, because basically the system was deeply unbalanced. And the dynamics of the stocks would be that if they became flows, would generate an inflationary disaster. The first thing we did was to correct the type of exchange. And by making the type of exchange jump, the expectation of a valuation disappeared. And that allowed us to arbitrate the rate in pesos and dollars, although it was positive in terms of dollars. In pesos, it was negative. I say this because the International Monetary Fund and many domestic economists said that we had to raise the interest rates. And if we had raised the interest rates, only if we had followed, for example, the consumer inflation of the first month, that is, already the following month, we did not have 4 hidden bases in the center. And imagine that it would not have ended well. So what did we do? We said that we would arbitrate the rate. And that was what allowed us to liquefy in part the debt of the central bank, while those who were in those positions were still earning in dollars. Is it okay? But not only that, that debt should never have been in the central bank, because that debt was generated basically because the state gave untransferable letters and took dollars to the central bank. Alternatively, asked for advance of utilities or other bribes or transfers, and that made to finance a tax. And in reality, and then a central bank rescued that money, paying interest rate. That is, it was an indirect form of indebtedness of the national treasury. Then that there should never have been within the central bank. It should be at the head of the government. And then in a titanic work, the president of the central bank, Santiago Bosoli, and the finance secretary, Pablo Corna, started a whole work to dismantle the monetary bases of the central bank and take them to the public sector, to the treasury, which is who had really been indebted, so that the problem I had caused, the public sector would not be transformed into a monetary passive problem with the harmful characteristics that inflation has, either because of the distortion that it generates in the relative prices, and therefore not only that it shrinks the horizon of planning of human beings, of individuals, because as Hayek said, the more the state plans, the less the individual plans. That is, the more the state gets, the more it ruins us, which also generates a distortion for economic calculation and makes it very complicated, but also, and that also impacts in a more cruel and violent way on the most vulnerable sectors. In fact, when we assume the very sincerity of the variables, take the levels of poverty to 57%, basically in Argentina, the official measurement of poverty is done in a semestral way. This makes sense, because the variable is growing. In a semestral, the average is placed, and it is a number that is underestimating, not because the index does not do well, but actually, for example, to the Soviet, to the communist of the province of Buenos Aires, because at one point he eliminated the statistics, because it seems stigmatizing. It is interesting, because the media, that's why when I saw him here at Wall Street Wolverine, it gave me a lot of joy, because he has a wonderful phrase that says, "We do not hate journalists enough." Imagine that in a musher way, having eliminated public work transfer, something that could not be eliminated. It was the official measure. So if you see that in some Argentine media garbage, they say that Matey Kennedy is false, because let's say I was born in the 70s, but then basically the interesting thing is that we, when lowering the country's risk, quickest start during all this, their transfer. And the most interesting thing is that there is another issue that is important, that is not contemplated in poverty, in the measurement, because you have the prices. There are price controls, so you had the price controls, and they had those prices marked. But what is the problem? That you went to the gondola and the good was not there. So poverty was already underestimated because the effect of the shortage, and they were going to look for the product. The product was not there, and consequently they had to buy another one that was more expensive, or the distortion that you modify your path or your consumption pattern in the light, or the distortions of the price controls because they are deviating consumption. And obviously, when we sincerely owe that, poverty was 57%. There, if the media trash said that poverty was going to go up to 57%, then when the number began to fall, obviously the measurements are no longer useful, neither private nor monthly or anything. It only works against where the improvement is worse, but let's say it continues to hurt more the media garbage, because they are accomplices of the political views. Today poverty is below the 35%. We lowered poverty by 22%. And that implies that 10 million people came out of poverty. That is to say that we, the heartless, the insensitive, The bad in the movie of the libertarian liberals. Precisely, we favor with greater strength those who have less, taking out 10 million people. Poverty. Therefore, in that context, we were then making the passage of the debt of the central bank to the national state, and then someone can say, no good, but they were increasing the debt. Or other things that say these. I did not want to tell you primate because I think that society animal protectors, I would have to report by mistreatment animals. Believe that I have to talk to simios who believe that rolling the dice is taking on that. When it is so easy, because if we take the amount of debt that weighs on the media garbage and the political cash, we are the first government in history that in a year we lower debt, and we lower $45,000 million of debt. It is true that partly because we liquefy with this arbitration of taxes, but it is also true that 25,000 millions of dollars we pay cash. Then, by the middle of last year, it was finished to clean the central bank. And if it seemed like a lot to make a fiscal adjustment of 5 points of the GDP, imagine then that in 6 months, a fiscal adjustment of 15 points of the GDP, making the largest fiscal adjustment in the history of humanity. Not only that, but also, as if it were not enough, we returned 2 points of the GDP at a rate of 19 taxes. We are doing something for the model of freedom, but even so, inflation still cost him to go down. We held that. In addition, monetary policy has an 18 to 24 months lag. That's why days ago, I pointed out publicly that for half of next year, inflation will have been history in Argentina because we leave constant the amount of money since the middle of last year did not grow more. Therefore, sooner or later, the inflation rate in Argentina will disappear. And in that sense, we detect another problem we had. The levels of monetary aggregates in Argentina were very low. That is, the monetary base in terms of the GDP should oscillate between 10 and 15 points of the GDP. I was in 2.5. Then it was clear that there was potential money demand, so that a level jump in the money demand. But there is also another problem. As the economy is growing, we had to work very hard, despite what the Keynesians were baptizing, because one of the things they said, if made an adjustment of these characteristics, we were going to sink into a recession. Adjustments of half the size had generated drops of 15% GDP. Therefore, we were in a disaster in times of activity, employment, poverty. It is interesting because the previous government had left us a negative statistical track in the GDP because it had been falling from about 3%. When you take the final number, it is a number that is in terms of 1.5. But if you take the monthly frequency, the GDP of December 24, despite having made the biggest reduction in the history of humanity, the GDP ended 6% above the GDP of December 23, with which we also ended with another myth that the Keynesians Intervention is that adjusting to the state is recessive, while reducing the state was expansive. So, in the face of that situation, that the demand for money had to be recomposed because inflation was going down, that the economy is growing. In fact, between April and December, the economy expanded 10%. In the first quarter, it expanded 6%. In the second quarter, it is going to be 8%. It is clear that given the fixed amount of money, we are going to have a problem because the demand for money is growing a lot, and I have the fixed amount of money. The monetary base I have fixed. So as long as there is excess money, as a result of the interventions of the national state, of control of exchange, of the type of exchange, and other controls of prices, I recommend emphatically see the monetary chapter of the man. The economy and the state of Rothbard describes the money overhang to perfection, with which God leaves them as a nice task to do. Then, in fact, the excess money we had was at least twice what we had had in the Rodriguez in 1975, when the inflation rate multiplied by 6. And in that sense, that is, as long as there's money overhang, we can continue to maintain this trend of fixed amount of money and growing demand of money, because it is absorbing that money overhang, either part by prices and part by quantities. The problem arises as soon as that number runs out. The inflation rate becomes 0, and Argentina has to start to transit deflation, but with a contractual structure not adequate to that. I quote, even the fatigue must have crumbled at least. I quote the beautiful book of Felipe Agus, defending deflation, but the contractual structure is there, and the electric chair. There are always people willing to turn it on. Then, basically, we said, how do we make people start using dollars? Because Argentina is a country that has, today, to give you an idea, 10 monetary bases outside the system are dollars that the Argentines took out of the system, are equivalent to 10 monetary bases, because in the end, the amount of money within the economy is determined by individuals, because in the end, the demand for money is the market of goods. Consequently, the real amount of money in an economy is determined by individuals, and there is nothing better than monetization of the economy done by individuals. Then, in that context, we launched the first stage, the endogenous dollarization, where people could start making all their transactions in a foreign currency, can make, and any currency you want in Argentina. However, it did not work. People did not do them. They kept using the pesos. People did not monetize. Then we said, well, we also eliminate half the CEPO. And then we started working on the elimination of the CEPO, of the capital controls. And one of the things that seemed very important to us was to fix the balance of the central bank, because basically the central bank's assets are debt. I know that by means of transfer and exit, the real balance has to be 0. And it can be 0 either because I paid that debt or because the prices were infinite. Now, the more robust the asset of the central bank, and consequently, the more the balance of the central bank, the lower the long-term price level. And if I take the price level today and the long-term one, the slope as the underlying inflation that this economy has, therefore, as long as I clean up the balance of the central bank, the asset of the central bank is robust. That is, in stage 2, we clean the passes of the central bank. In stage 3, we basically started working on the asset of the central bank, making it more solvent, so that the long-term price level is lower, and therefore the inflation to which the system travels falls. With that, we went to the International Monetary Fund, and we made an absolutely revolutionary proposal, because in general all countries go to the International Monetary Fund. For what? To ask for a debt to finance a tax. That is, so that they can do it gradually, so that it does not hurt people, which is a lie. That is, the best thing you can do is hard and pure rejection of public spending, because it is to retire money to people at goals. Then we went to the International Monetary Fund, and we asked to build a package to clean the balance of the central bank, to clean the assets of the central bank for those pesos that they have in the pockets, to clean the asset of the central bank so that the peso that people have in their pocket, each Argentine of good begins to have a counterpart of value that is not a painted paper. And in that context, our estimate said that to get out of that sepulcher, we needed about $12 billion, and as much as everything touches point as I'm very risk-averse, because outside it is easy, but with the electric chair it is not so easy. Then we said we are going to go into a bond scheme, but we open if they give us $15 billion so that we could deliver, let's say we could buy pesos with dollars for the equivalent of $3 billion. The terminology is not trivial if you look at it. I'm using a different terminology because others would say we would sell $3 billion, but I am saying something else. I am buying pesos because what I'm saying is I want to leave the amount of money constant. I want to finish with the scam of siring, because the question is not if the inflationary tax is zero. That is a lie, because then if I have growth in the demand for money and I accompany it with growth in the supply at all prices, they do not rise. It is true, but I am scamming people. Or perhaps if I am not emitting money, if the central bank was not emitting money, there would have been healthy deflation for growth, and there is demand of the scam. Therefore, it is necessary to terminally prohibit emitting money. And in that context, we set off the program. We had to suffer all kinds of pressure. From the opposition, we had to endure all kinds of lies from journalists. Clearly corrupt pressing, so that we go wrong, spreading all kinds of lies. I had to face the situation of reading that I was doing, that I was supposedly making my Minister of Economy resign, and I was on the plane with the Minister of Economy designing the political aspects of economic policy, or having to go to meetings. And they took me to a cost. I said, well, you are not going to throw it. No, that is what generates the shit of the journalists. That is why I think they are being so despicable in a 90%. Then that was not free, that because it generated a lot of volatility, we had to announce the program that we were going to do something. We did it on March 1, and between the complicity of the journalist garbage and the garbage of politics, they generated a lot of instability. We dropped the demand for money. Inflation climbed to 3.7% monthly. They said that when we hyped, it was going to go between 5 and 7%, and from there it was going to start to spiralize, and it was not going to go down ever again. In the end, we ended up getting a package of $49,000 million. Basically 20,000 from the fund, 12,000 from the World Bank, 10,000 from the BID, 2,000 from a repo and the Chinese government that refinanced the swap in that context. What did journalists and politicians say? That in no way was I going to encourage myself to open the SIPA in an electoral year, that if I did it, it would be after the elections. However, I said that if they gave me $15 billion cash, I would open the program. It contains $20 billion cash, and how to do the right thing, it is not negotiated, because freedom is not negotiated. When we get the program with $20 billion cash, we open the SIPO. I also want to make a note of color about this, the reason for the bans. The reality is that Argentina is a society that was used to living in the continuous financial repression during the last 90 years. To such an extent that, for example, it is very rooted in that the chunks in the type of exchange, that is, a devaluation of the currency leads to the appearance of inflation, and in reality that is like there is a causation from the type of change to the level of prices, when in reality the causation is from the amount of money to the prices, where the type of exchange is a price plus, and as it is a financial asset, it climbs first and then the others follow. That is, if they knew the effect that a chandelier, let's say, they could see it with clarity. That is, I can have a situation where the demand for money falls in an arbitration against the dollar, then first the dollar rises, then the transavos, then at the wholesale rise, and the consumer prices rise, and finally the salaries rise. That is why it is also highly unpopular devaluation, but it has to do with the problem of what is happening in the monetary market, because if I would have a reason decide to demand more dollars, or because I change my preference, or because there is a change in the international context to the currency market that leads to the dollar being more expensive, if I keep buying the same amount of dollars that I am going to spend now, greater proportion of my income I am going to have to apply there. That means that I am going to have to spend less in other places, and therefore those prices are going to fall. If they have read the economy in a Harley election, they would know, but they did not read. Then what happens in that case? There is no problem, and it is clearly shown that there is no cause from the type of exchange at the level of prices now. Well, if the central bank in the consideration supposes that the prices are not going to fall, and it emits, then the monetary emission that validates appears. Then, as we have been living in that disease for 90 years, where there's always been inflation, because in addition to the monetary invalidation, it is not that it came later, it had already been generated for financing the tax deficit. And what is the point? The point is that people had found that there was a relationship between the type of change and the level of prices, and the reality is that for 90 years that model gave him the reason. It is as if I had stopped, let's say, at the time that Malthus wrote and his model, and I look back, if I give the task to an economist, Malthus was right, and yet he was wrong fiercely. Then what happens in that context? Basically, we find ourselves with that we had to explain that the relationship went from the length of money to the prices, and because people are not to blame for what happened during the last 90 years, and then we had to float, but that people were not afraid. That is to say that the problem was known, but that is why the band set is why roof, and that is why floor. But see that both the roof and the floor move at 1% per month. The roof grows at 1% per month, and the floor goes down at 1% per month. The limit, they go to a free exchange. And where did that idea come from? That's why there's nothing more subtle than a good theory. If you are lucky enough to take a general balance course, you will find that first part of a general balance course works with functions, that is to say, applications point by point, so that you can show that the book exists, but that it is also unique. The part of the stability is easy, because assuming that the direct effects are greater than the cost reaches, and over which is quite obvious, that is to say, more to obvious that the price of tea hits more on the tea market than on the coffee. I say you do not have to be a genius for that in that sense. Basically, that is the first demonstration of existence that they do with clustered groups and others to be able to apply fixed point theorem. Later, they want to generate it, they want to make it more general, then they work with correspondence, that is to say, applications point together. This is to say, they allow other types of levels of more violent substitution, so to speak, in a way. And the most broadest stage of all is when you do not narrow the economy, that the economy is not narrow. That brings some problems from the mathematical point of view, because to apply the fixed point theorem, it needs that those grips are closed, narrowed, that they are convex, that the functions are continuous, and that if they are correspondence, they are semi-continuous superior. But what does the last stage do? It releases that. Restriction that the set is narrowed. Then the problem is that we cannot apply that fixed point theorem. That is, we have a problem in the fixed point theorem are made like that. We say no as we want them. What is the trick that economists of general balance do? They generate an artificially narrowed economy. That is to say, it is not narrowed, but I invent a quid, and if when I'm going to prove existence, the balance is not on the edge, then it means that now that balance exists, and all the properties of the balance. This is exactly the same process, not only what we did, we artificially narrow. And the other type of change within the band fluctuated. They said that obviously the economists and their partners, the journalists, garbage 90%, so that later they did not. Quite now we put all the same bike. I say only 90% lie recurrently. Then it is interesting. This is not because we have fallen in the ranking of freedom of expression, not like that. Of course, they know why we fell in a ranking. Because we removed the official guidelines, that is to say, precisely, we gave them freedom to do what they're told to say. They can tell me anything, but of course it seems that I touch the most sensitive organ of the human being, the pocket. Then after saying that the type of exchange was going to go to the roof of the band, that we were going to release thousands and thousands of millions of dollars, the inflation was going to skyrocket, that it was going to go to levels of 5 or 7%, and that later it was not going to go down more. The type of change went down, and it is closer to the floor than the roof is more. Think about this, because this is the basic bank economy. Once still studying the basic books, they graph supply demand. Now then they put it in the case of a minimum price. That happens when I put a minimum price. There is an excess of demand, and the price in the parallel market is up. If you release, what happens? The quantities expand and the price passes and the price falls. What happened? The amount transferred in the exchange market increased strongly, and the price was at an intermediate point closer to the floor than the roof point. For economic theory, another all against for journalists and economists lies. Then, well, we are already out of the well, now it is all back. The endogenous adoration begins. It did not happen. It did not happen. Now we had opened the basket, but everything with what he had not skipped the type of exchange. It had not been done. Nothing had happened of all the things that they said, and it did not happen. And then recently we sent one of the most revolutionary reforms, which is the historic repair to the Argentine Oris. Where in Argentina, until that day, we were all guilty of tax evasion. Except that we could prove the opposite. From this measure, we are all innocent. Until the collection agency shows the opposite. And that this is also very interesting, because the burden of proof is reversed. That is, apart from the fact that I believe that the state is a violent criminal organization and taxes are robbery, but I need time. I am going to tell you something that you're also going to like. Today, Argentina must has about $450 billion in debt. Funds. With a team of Anarcho-capitalism, we assume that if we are in power until 2031, that is to say that the Argentines in 27 decide to accompany us, and with that, on the path of growth in which Argentina has started, we estimate that we could be growing at rates between 6 and 8% per year. And not only that, but also we are going to, every year, we are going to return 1.5% of the GDP in taxes. That means that at the end of the mandate, we will be returning to the Argentines a slight amount of $500 billion. Then I am going to make a very simple explanation of what this fourth monetary transformation is going. That implied doing as 300, that to remove 300 regulations. And in that sense, basically, when they have to declare earnings, they declare income, and they make them declare consumption. Then what happens? Suppose that he spent 100, but spent 400, then you have to inform the collection agency that you spent 400 also. Then what happens? Does not close the differential of 300. Then what did the collection agency also look at that patrimony variation in such a way that if the patrimony did not fall in 300, It fell out there, and there was a whole series of controls. That is, for example, every time you go to the supermarket, if the purchase exceeded the equivalent of $100, you had to inform the collection agency, so that more or less of the level of survey control that we were masked as the control tyranny. I loved it. And then what did we do? We removed that there is to declare the consumer and the patrimonial variation, and today we say we do not have to inform anything except that he spent more than $50,000 per month in that way. That is what happens. You're going to encounter a situation that today the Argentines can take out the dollars that are outside the system and use them freely, and there will be no way under which the collection agency can perceive them. And this is very interesting, because basically what it allows is that then now individuals can monetize the economy when and how they want. That is the only thing they are going to have to do, is take out the dollars from the mattress whenever they want, as they want, in the way they want. That is, they will be able to use all that money freely. They will be able to dispose of the fruit of their work freely, and no one is going to pursue them. Therefore, if we have in the mattresses hidden 10 monetary bases, when all this process is taken place, we are going to find a monetary base in pesos. And we are going to have the equivalent of 11 monetary bases in dollars. Therefore, dollarizing and closing the central bank will be as easy as a snap of fingers. That is, which, although during the campaign I promised the free election of currency, well inspired by Hayek, and that wonderful, but the denationalization of money, they're closing the central bank is as easy as a snap of fingers. But saying this, I have not negotiated any of my postulates and what I want to do to cause this. Because I used to say first government of Mena had been the best government in the history of Argentina. During their government's very successful stabilization program was set, which was convertibility in 100 structural reforms were made. Our stabilization program is making inflation go down much faster than convertibility, but with some differences. First, there was never control of prices or a court reorder, and let's say to discipline. There was no previous hyperinflation that left the real balance so low that the remonetization itself and the recovery of the demand for money allowed to stabilize more quickly the type of change that is a shock was not controlled, so that it was much faster. Not only that, property rights were not expropriated, that is, Argentina complied with the creditors who owed them the debt of the imports. Argentina complied with the creditors that the central bank had. Argentina complied with the International Monetary Fund, and Argentina also honored the debt with the market. That is, we did all this without generating a single expropriation, we respect the property rights. And if this were not enough, many stabilization programs in the light of the problems with subsidies started first. Someone had to do the dirty work. If someone came and devalued, someone came and liquefied, someone came and expropriated, someone came and, let's say, the price of the tariffs went up. We found that the tariffs at the time of assuming covered only 20% of the cost. The regular tariffs today cover 100%, and despite all this, the inflation rate, if we measure it in dollars, it went down because in convertibility there was a type of change 1-to-1. It went down much faster than convertibility. Is more, as I was telling you, consumer inflation came to touch levels of 300% per year and stayed. Travels to 20% per year, and it will disappear in the middle of next year. But if you look at the wholesale inflation, that is the one that leads, the one that have been traveling at 54% and at touch peaks of 500-600 per year, it is likely that this month the wholesale inflation that is going to be reported on Tuesday that begins with 0. That is to say that we are going to be passing levels of 500-600% to levels of less than 10% per year, and all this respecting the right of ownership. We have not violated anyone, everything done in freedom. And if in addition to that we add that we made 2,500 structural reforms, not only that we have an anti-inflationary program then that was better than convertibility, but also it is 25 times more reformist only in a year and a half, with 15% of the Chamber of Deputies and 10% of the Chamber of Senators. No matter how much they do not like the eco-80s, no matter how much they do not like the journalists, we are the best government in history.